Anyway, let's see.
This
Second Thought had some interesting thoughts about this, apparently.
Anyway, this episode is absolutely going to get demonetized. So if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Is Putin crazy? Probably. Most likely, at least a little bit. Does it matter? Also yes. That's the short answer for this video. The long answer, well, it's obviously more complicated than that. Let's talk about mainstream coverage of the conflict. Because this situation is fraught and constantly evolving, here's your disclaimer. Hit pause before you start fighting in the comments.
The video was written on February 21st and March 1st.
In case you didn't read it, this video isn't going to be defending Putin or Russia. The invasion/war in Ukraine is unequivocally wrong. Even if you were to take Russia's rhetoric about NATO expansion at face value, which, yes, NATO has been kicking the hornet's nest for some time now, this conflict is a dramatic, dangerous, and horrific overreaction. My heart goes out to the people of these two countries who will suffer terribly in a war they did not want.
Second Thought is really fucking, I love Second Thought, man. I mean, listen, right off the bat, straight to the fucking point, none of that bullshit, none of the fucking posturing, 100%, I agree with our boy here.
In this episode, I'm going to try and answer a couple of questions, but I'll mostly be looking into why that question gets asked in the first place, how useful it is, both in the short and the long term, and what focusing on that question leaves out of the picture. This video is going to try to understand this whole situation a little bit better without getting into the specific details of the conflict. We're not going to rehash the whole history of Ukraine.
Stop sucking his cock. I will suck his cock as much as I want, dude. Okay? And you listen good, motherfucker. I will suck whatever cock I want to suck on this broadcast. You listen to me? You got a problem with that? You can take it elsewhere, okay?
Ukraine or Russia. We're not going to go into the details about Euromaidan or Crimea. We're going to look at the way we tell the story of the conflict, not the conflict itself. Significant chunks of this video will be speculative. Most analysis of the conflict is at this time. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, and I invite you.
Of course, the difference is when you are speculating alongside the overarching Western media narrative, you're good and right. And even if you're wrong, it doesn't matter because you're doing it for morale reasons. But if you are ever getting outside of the common consensus, immediately people are like, oh, fuck you, you're doing propaganda, you're doing apologia, you piece of shit.
You to respond to this video and critique it to your heart's content. In any case, this video won't come down on a single conclusion for each topic, but rather put out a couple ideas and leave it up to you to decide what you want to take away. So, let's get back to Putin. Recently, this is the kind of coverage he's been getting.
He is just basking in his own hubris.
Do you think that he has it in him, and Putin in particular, to actually pull that lever, so to speak, or press that button?
Well, I personally think...
Dude, Sushi, I am so close to banning you. Stop linking Gray Zone. Stop linking every kind of fucking article you can, okay? Max Blumenthal is, much like Ukraine is Russia's red line, Max Blumenthal is mine, okay? You are greatly fucking exhausting the charity I have. Stop it, okay?
I think he's unhinged.
Senator Marco Rubio posted a tweet that caught my attention. He said,
like when you say Max Blumenthal is spitting, okay? When you say Max Blumenthal is spitting, it's like, okay, dude, well, you know, come on.
Wish I could share more, but for now I can say it's pretty obvious to many that something is off with Putin.
Even if they have the right take on this, which I'm not saying they do, but even if they did, there are 11 better sources than motherfucking Max Blumenthal. How about you find someone else, okay? Rather than someone who has already exhausted what little credibility they may have had. No matter what happens, here's the thing. People who are outside of the mainstream narrative, especially when it comes to foreign conflicts and foreign policy, especially are going to be vilified regardless. But Max Blumenthal has done way more than that, okay?
He has always been a killer, but his problem now is different and significant. It would be a mistake to assume this Putin would react the same way he would have 5 years ago.
For a lot of observers, Putin does seem crazy. And there's some evidence that, in the short term, talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict by focusing on Putin being crazy has had some advantages. As we've seen, it is one of the factors that has brought a lot of nations together in supporting Ukraine, leveraging their military resources, economic power, and diplomatic platforms to criticize, deter, and weaken the Russian aggression. At least, that's the hope for the alliance led by the West. The positive outcome being, hopefully, a swift end to the conflict and to the immediate violence on the ground. A negative peace. Both within Russia and in cities all over the world, we've seen protests against the war and against Putin himself. There's no doubt that that kind of public support is justifying and being used as justification for the response to Russia. It is fueling the image of Putin as a deranged maniac that needs to be stopped right away. So far, that framing has been effective in souring public opinion on the conflict and pushing for peace talks, though with some important limitations we'll get to in a second. There's also the nuclear issue. The fear that has been stoked by Putin's escalating rhetoric around nuclear weapons. Specifically, the idea that a deranged Putin could press the button no one with any shred of sanity would ever press has likely contributed to the haste with which bystander countries have pushed for diplomatic resolutions to the conflict. It is incredibly scary to imagine nuclear warfare breaking out, and people know that and will do anything to avoid it. This, again, will hopefully mean a quick return to a negative peace between the two countries, but is of course a net positive for Russian interests, which can leverage this situation for an upper hand in negotiations. That upper hand might force Ukraine to make significant concessions, ultimately giving Russia territorial or other gains without the invading country needing to get them through the more quote-unquote conventional use of total occupation. There is a chance that Putin knows this and is exploiting what's called the madman theory. He knows that threatening nuclear warfare is not credible to anybody who rationally balances out the pros, minor territorial, symbolic, and economic victories, with the cons, the annihilation of the human species. So he is purposefully playing up the image of a madman who can't rationally balance these two sides. Acting convincingly crazy gives him the upper hand in negotiations because it makes nuclear warfare seem like it could be real, even though it is utterly irrational. For the West and Ukraine, this poses a challenge of how to respond to Putin. On the one hand, treating the nuclear threat at face value gets countries to the negotiation table quickly.
This is basically your take, to be honest? Yeah, well, I mean, smart and cool and handsome minds think alike, you know?
But on unequal terms. On the other, it makes military support and intervention complicated. In one theory, it slows
The West just had to nut up and call Putin's bluff. It's scary as fuck, but it has to be done at some point. Yeah, dude. Let's bluff about nuclear weapons. Dude, this guy solved the Cold War. We didn't need to do any of that, man. We could have just listened to Twitch chatter Serial Killers 22. All of these otherwise warmongering American intelligence assets, American military defense contractors, all these guys, for some reason, are being incredibly careful about this one particular situation. If anything, knowing everything that you know, by the way, I'm not like dunking on this guy. I don't want it to come across like I'm just making fun of them. But if you don't know anything about the situation whatsoever, think about that. You know America loves war. So why aren't they doing it? Just think about that. What is America? If America that loves war normally is not waging one, you got to understand, like, it's a serious fucking situation.
Slows down any sort of Western military action. If Putin is crazy and his biggest perceived threat is NATO, pushing his buttons will lead us straight into nuclear Armageddon, so the West should not intervene. According to another way of thinking, if Putin is crazy, everything is on the table to stop him, so the West has to intervene. The latter, by the way, is the kind of logic that comes up when people are asked how we should deal with terrorists. According to an experiment by Princeton researchers, if test subjects are told that terrorists are bloodthirsty fanatics, maniacs ready to spill the blood of millions of people, they are more likely to advocate for unilateral military responses and, removal attempts. When terrorists are presented as rational, they're more likely to advocate for negotiation. These two ideas, the madman theory...
And by the way, this is why people get so mad at me. Even though Putin is behaving in a way that is erratic and irrational, this is why people get mad at me whenever I say negotiations have to happen, negotiations have to happen. In their minds, that like, you can't negotiate with this guy. He's fucking crazy. We can't negotiate with terrorists. And it's understandable that they feel this way because Putin is acting in an irrational capacity. He's a terrorist. He's a madman. He doesn't care. Okay, well, if he doesn't care, then he's gonna fucking nuke regardless. You see what I'm saying? If nuclear war and nuclear holocaust is inevitable, then how can you justify not trying to exhaust the diplomatic option to its final place that you can exhaust it to? You see what I mean? This is why I've always talked about the neutralization approach. This is why I've always talked about the NATO approach from day one. If it's inevitable, if it's gonna happen no matter what, then what? Like, what? Are you trying to save face? He's pretending not to care, bro. If you had actually watched the video, I can't.
The theory and the terrorist example are contradictory. In one theory, being crazy gets you to the negotiation table. In the other, it's being sane that gets you negotiating. The big reason for that difference is nuclear weapons. When you have to factor in the death and destruction of everyone and everything you love, how you treat an irrational actor is very different. This puts the West and its media institutions in a complicated position. Treat Putin as a madman, and you can justify your role in this war. You can play off the fear and frustration that gets ordinary people to start thinking about what would happen if Putin was removed tomorrow. But it also means you'll have to negotiate against the guy with the upper hand. Treat him like a rational actor who would never ever detonate a nuclear weapon, and you risk getting it wrong like you did with this invasion. Except this time, the consequence is nuclear annihilation. Because remember that less than a month ago, Putin's threats to invade Ukraine weren't thought of as very credible to many outside observers. Even for those who warned of Russian aggression, the idea that so much of the country, including Kyiv, would be bombed didn't seem likely. Putin knows this. He knows how his unpredictability shapes the responses he gets, and is purposefully leveraging it. That, or he's genuinely deranged. We might never know. I'll give you my thoughts at the end. Overall, treating Putin as a deranged warmonger seems to have been a rough net positive, at least up to this point and in the short term. More important caveats coming soon. On the whole, it has been a key factor in stopping nuclear warfare from breaking out, assuming that threat was at the very least possible, and it has created urgency around diplomatic resolution, even if on extortionary terms. That is certainly better than the alternative: nuclear annihilation or never-ending conflict. Unfortunately, the forest might start getting lost in the trees depending on how the rest of this short-term response is carried out. In the scramble to arm Ukraine, Western countries may be creating a new Afghanistan. The West could be arming paramilitary organizations which, once the immediate conflict is settled, could pose an internal threat, and would inevitably be used to justify more lethal aid, more interventions, and more imperialist aggression. The kind we've seen ravage the Middle East.
Damn, what a good take from this guy. Wow, that's wild.
For decades. What Western countries see as the most reasonable short-term response, giving Ukraine the means to defend itself against a much more powerful aggressor, may lead to unintended consequences. Or hell, maybe they are intended, I wouldn't be surprised. Consequences that could bring proxy imperialist wars back to the forefront of international relations in the long term. There's also a concern that treating Putin like this has actually done the opposite of the escalate to de-escalate strategy, with some still very minor today, but nonetheless present voices calling for a preemptive strike or a full-scale NATO involvement. Again, this is highly speculative. Thinking about the short term with so many competing narratives and the uncertainty surrounding Putin's mental state leads to an impossible number of forks and alternative histories, many of them terrifying to imagine. When thinking about the long term, then, it may be beneficial to subscribe to a different way of telling history. Instead of focusing on the individual, and therefore subscribing to the great man theory of history, the idea that history is shaped by great leaders above all else, it may be better to understand the conflict from a more institutional, economic, and materialistic approach. A historical materialism of some sort, if that was even a real thing. I've certainly never heard of it.
Yeah, what is that? That's such a weird take. I've never heard of that either.
And before we do, just to be clear, focusing on Putin at a time like this is not entirely wrong. Putin sits at the helm of a country he has profoundly shaped for over 2 decades. The way Russia acts in most affairs does usually boil down to whatever Putin says, because his status as an autocrat grants him far more decision-making power than any one person should ever have.
Yep.
The point of a historical materialist approach isn't to deny that, but to explain how it is that he gets to have such a strong decision-making power in the first place, and what factors exist that guide and constrain, or alternatively give him carte blanche when he is exercising it. At the time of writing, some people are predicting that the heavy costs of sanctions and military operations against Russia will make Putin incredibly unpopular at home and abroad, possibly ending up with him not leading Russia anymore. If that is the case, if Putin does leave office, our fixation on him and him alone may lead to an overconfidence in the stability of whatever peace we hopefully get on the other side. Just because Putin is out of the picture doesn't mean everything is okay. So our analysis of the conflict must also take into account what will survive after Putin is gone. Let's give that a shot. Thus far, the analysis of the Ukraine-Russia conflict has been done on 2 big lines. According to the liberal philosophy of international relations, this conflict has been driven by ideas.
Oh shit. Shots fired at Johnny Boy. It's just like the idealistic version of these events are so fucking, oh God, I don't even want to get into it. It's so frustrating. It's so incredibly frustrating. Like, oh yeah, he hates a Jeffersonian democracy. That's why he invaded. That part of liberal international relations is literally fucking stupider than even just saying with outright that Putin is a madman. Who knows what the fuck he's gonna do? Like, if there's one type of analysis in this circumstance that is more childish than saying outright, Putin's a madman, he's got nukes, who knows what he'll do with that, he wants to institute the Russian Empire, is literally the liberal version of saying he hates our freedoms, okay? It completely is devoid of any sort of understanding of the reality on the ground in these like Baltic states. It is completely devoid of any sort of analysis whatsoever, and is just saying like his motivation is he hates democracy. Anyway.
Ideas and international institutions. Putin is committed to the idea of a unified Russian identity inherited from the USSR and the greater history of Russian nations. Putin wants Ukraine, or at least part of it, because he is interested in uniting all people who are tied to the Russian identity and history they share. Debates in liberal circles are over the degree to which Ukrainians in the east of the country are really more like Russians, and whether that's sufficient justification for the breach of international law. Usually, in the West at least, their answer
I love how you protect Putin so woke. Yeah, dude, I love Putin. I'm always trying to suck him off to avoid war. It's just fucking idiotic. Like, what democracy? What? We barely have a fucking democracy in bourgeois capitalist nation states. It's a theory, okay?
Is no. The other line of thinking, what is usually called the realist philosophy of international relations, sees this conflict in terms of military power and influence. Russia is invading Ukraine to keep the country as a barrier to NATO expansion and the threat of being undermined by a strong military at its borders in the future. Likewise, the realist analysis on the other side is that Russia is taking over Ukraine to expand its own influence and destabilize the EU. Debates here are about what threat NATO or Russia actually poses in terms of influence and military power. While there is an element of truth to both these philosophies, especially because different political leaders are desperately trying to make either one seem more true by acting as if it was, the third, less popular approach to this conflict is through the Marxist analysis of international relations. That's the historical materialism I mentioned earlier. This analysis tends to focus on the way in which economics and economic institutions play a role in explaining this war, and more generally sees economic motivations as the foundation upon which politics generally, and liberal and realist philosophies more specifically, can play out in the first place. Each theory is basically competing about which one comes first, not really about which one gets it right. They all kind of get part of it right in one way or another. Marxists see this conflict as being the consequence of an accumulation of economic and political power into a few hands. Following the fall of the USSR, the liberalization of Russia was dominated by the privatization of industries previously under state control. In their place, oligarchs who were either well-connected in the former USSR or exceedingly capable of navigating the newly liberalized economy consolidated major sectors of the economy.
Gangsters, dude. Straight fucking crooks, criminals, gangsters that literally robbed, cheated, raped, pillaged, whatever you want to fucking call it, the Russian economy. And Putin is exactly like them. He's one of them. And that, by the way, is entirely our fault. But, you know, that's a longer story. Like, literally entirely our fault, okay? Entirely our fault.
Economy, notably fossil fuels, into their very few hands. Thanks to this concentrated economic power, they were able to have a high degree of influence on politics, carrying Putin and his support for their endeavors into the highest office, from which he could carry national economic policy in a few key directions, specifically to enrich his buddies, while they both kept one another on a tight leash. It shouldn't be surprising that this is an unstable economic system, especially given how central a few key, non-renewable resources are.
Us in the chat, fuck did I do now? No, man. I mean, America, Western foreign policy. How do you think these guys, well connected with the West as well, were able to fucking command the entire economy of a fucking previous world superpower? I don't mean like you specifically. When I say we as the royal we, I'm talking about America, baby. I'm talking about the Western nations.
To the whole operation. Unlike the countries to its west, Russia did not benefit from a Marshall Plan that would have bolstered its capitalist economy within a strong network of cooperation with the big daddy of global economics, the US. Russia's privatization and primitive accumulation came with all the pitfalls and punishments of liberalism unadulterated, creating a punishing austerity for the general population, but
in the immediate aftermath, there was a literal fucking dip in the average life expectancy by 3 years, dude. That's how fucking devastating liberalization was for post-Soviet Russia.
lucrative profits for a few at the
Or
top.
was it 4? I thought it was 3 years, but
This
maybe it might be
allowed
4.
for and promoted a single figurehead with visions of expansion at its helm. Because when domestic crises begin in a capitalist society, they'll often turn towards nationalism and look at outward expansion for solutions. Of course, Russia isn't in a vacuum. While all this is happening, Ukraine is modernizing its agriculture and energy sources, cutting off Russian gas slowly, taking its role as a channel for Russian gas for the rest of Europe slowly off the table, and proving the value of its rich black soil, an incredibly fertile ground and a major source of profit. These are trends that Russian oligarchs have kept an eye on for a long time, threatening their profits the further away Ukraine gets from them, and a big reason to keep courting Ukrainian politicians. And look, I may not have all the details. Like most of you, this wasn't on my radar just a few weeks ago, and
Unironically, this is why Real Life Lore's video, out of all the videos I've seen thus far, was one of the absolute fucking best videos I've ever seen in Western media, in independent media, in the West, from a dude who's like a liberal too. It was so fucking good. Talking about the material interest that Russia has with respect to like an oil-rich region that it wants to control, talking about talking about the competing interests of like utilizing Ukraine as a way to stabilize and control Russian pricing and OPEC pricing of petrol. It doesn't sound like a liberal. I mean, no one. I don't believe anyone who does like international relations videos like that are fucking leftists usually, unless I know that they're not. I thought Real Life Lore was like straight up. I mean,
and the quote, real motivations behind this war are anybody's guess at this point. But if you think this sort of materialist analysis has some weight, you can see how focusing on Putin alone might pose an issue for the future. Once Putin is gone, that is, if Putin is gone, the economic relations between different countries in Europe and within Russia and its oligarchs will not disappear. There will be a tense relationship.
I have to read this.
Thanks for everything you do, Hassan.
Hassan, would it be agreeable to say you tend towards Marxist ideologies? What makes you say that, chatter? How dare you?
Relationship and within if Putin
I
is
love
gone,
capitalism. I love capitalism, and I hate socialism. Ew.
Economic relations between different countries in Europe and within Russia and its oligarchs will not disappear. There will be a tense relationship between Russia, a country with an economy dependent on resources many countries are trying to make obsolete, and the rest of Europe, increasingly wary of the influence and economic struggle Russia can create by turning off the gas. In that sense, while the character of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is entirely his own, the motivations that have pushed Putin into war precede him and any recent changes in international politics. He made the decision, an awful one, but the prevailing economic system and the specific way in which it was imposed on the post-USSR countries, with highly concentrated economic and political power in the hands of a few oligarchs, created the conditions in which Putin could make his decision and hope for it to be a good one for his economic interests. Really awful economic interests at
By the way, yes, Real Life Lord did say NATO is defensive and only allows democracies into its allegiance. That's why I said he's a liberal, but he's a liberal who nailed the materialist reasons behind Ukraine's interest, or Russia's interest in controlling Ukraine beyond the political interests in the defensive interests that they have. So that's right. And also, that's also why I always tell you, like, it's kind of suspicious that OPEC nations, right, a lot of which are supposedly America's allies, including America's greatest allies, Gulf nations and whatnot, why did they not engage in price stability that would cut out Russia from the equation? Like, why did America buy $700 million worth of gas, oil, and commodities from Russia the day before they fucking sanctioned Russia? If you can't comprehend these sorts of things, if you can't apply a leftist, i.e. a materialist analysis to this circumstance, You're going to think that's really weird. That's some fake friendship, brother. What the fuck? I didn't know this was happening. Oh, what the fuck? Are you doing Putin propaganda? Why? Why haven't the OPEC nations who are supposedly, idealistically on our side, good versus evil, why haven't they fucking engaged in price stability to ensure that, like, they could cut out Russia from the rest of the world? Because they like maintaining the fucking cartel that they have. They like maintaining the oligopoly they have over energy. That's it.
At that. To summarize this whole video, personalizing this conflict and making it about Putin makes sense in the short term. Over the long term, it doesn't become irrelevant, but it isn't nearly so central. Putin and the Ukraine-Russia war can therefore also be seen as a warning call for other countries with increasingly monopolistic capitalist economies and political systems prone to autocratic co-optation. When the scramble for resources begins, a network of genuine solidarity between ordinary, working people has the best chance of staving off war. The same can't be said of a global network based on maximizing profits and national competition with a handful of all-powerful people calling the shots. We can make pragmatic decisions in the short term, but should never lose sight of that fact. For what it's worth, I don't think Putin is crazy, but I do think he's been in power a long time and has grown accustomed to doing whatever he wants, regardless of what his advisors have to say. Finally, as a last addendum, don't try to use bits and pieces of this analysis to justify any sort of imperialism, whether that's whatever Putin's Russia is doing or sending Western intervention into Ukraine. There is no justification for the violence we've seen and for calls to escalate. We can understand the motivations and economic context that has made our current situation more likely without falling into deterministic thinking, that is, assuming all this was destined to happen, or believing these actions are justified. They are not. War isn't a spectator sport as the internet would have you believe. It's not a Marvel movie with clearly defined good guys and bad guys. We should.
Zelensky fans want Jeremy Renner to play the Ukrainian president in a movie. Exactly. This shit is so fucking lame, dude.
Not be rooting.
People are dying and they're like, oh my God, he's Captain America.
For one army to massacre another. Those soldiers don't.
Also, those people don't even know that Zelensky himself is a fucking actor. Like, he could play himself if he wanted to, and he has. He's so.
Stand to gain anything from this conflict. They're normal people just like you and me. The only people who will come out on top are those at the levers of power of the bloodthirsty imperialist nations. All we should be calling for is for this conflict to be resolved quickly, without a ransacking of Ukraine, without nuclear weapons being detonated, without the expansion of NATO, and through diplomacy.
Yep.
No war but class war.
What do you think about Israel's prime minister visit to Moscow? Are they settling Israel as the mediator? That's extremely funny. No, it's not extremely funny. Israel has deep ties to both Russia and Ukraine. It's perfectly understandable that a country that is not immediately Western, is not seen as a Western nation, that because both countries obviously mistrust Western nations and Western institutions, that has deep ties to both countries, can remain kind of like a neutral party in that situation. So, of course, that's the reason why they're doing it. The irony, of course, is that, like, Israel is doing annexation and, an apartheid is an apartheid state. Nobody gives a fuck about the irony, okay? So here, this is insane. Mersheimer is being accused of possibly being a Russian asset. See note about funding and all these insinuations. University of Chicago students circulating a letter calling for the cancellation of John Mersheimer over Putinism and anti-Ukrainian ideology and spreading Russian disinformation like that. There was a coup in 2014 and it included fascists. No, it's fucking dope, dude. It's like straight up. Hey, if you like this video, please subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any future videos.